Disregard. Next up for 7 minutes, Mr. Angus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to say at the outset how important the work of your office is. I think for too many years we've been played for suckers by Silicon Valley, that it was about choice, that it was opt-in, opt-out. You know, we could read the privacy provisions. They've never respected the privacy provisions in building their models. What we've learned with Cambridge Analytica and Facebook is that this is not simply a question of the rights and the choices of consumers. This is about the democratic rights of citizens. It's about the questions of a nation state being able to actually ensure that its citizens can live in a world where they choose certain rights that are protected and inalienable. And one of those rights, as you said, is the right to be free from surveillance. So I want to start off with just a few simple questions. So your finding was that Facebook broke the law of Canada with its breach of PIPEDA. Is that correct? And as an officer of Parliament, you have been mandated to ensure compliance of PIPEDA. So was your report an opinion, or is that a finding of fact by the officer in charge of representing the Parliament of Canada in preserving our laws?
It's a finding of fact in law. Under the current law is not binding on the corporation being monitored by this agency.
And so Facebook initially stated that you didn't have jurisdiction because you couldn't prove that the 620-some thousand Canadians who had their private information stolen, that they weren't somehow affected. Did then they move on to say, well, it was an opinion of yours and they'd take it under advisement? I mean, where are they? Is it your opinion, or that the fact that we don't have jurisdiction? What is Facebook's response to you on this?
They raised the jurisdictional question. We've answered it in our report. They never acquiesced to our jurisdiction. They pursued a discussion with us as though we had jurisdiction, but never conceded that we had jurisdiction. So that's the state of affairs. If Facebook raises this issue in the federal court when we file our application, the court will decide whether we have jurisdiction.
So when we began our hearings, and I first wrote to you, it was the spring of 2018 when the Cambridge Analytica scandal had just blown up, and we had found that 620-some thousand Canadians had their information taken, and Facebook was made aware of that in 2015 and made no efforts to tell Canadians. They said at the time when they came to our committee in 2018 that they had a very robust response. It seems to me, I'm flabbergasted that a company would look at a finding of law and say, well, we simply don't recognize your jurisdiction. Are you aware of other examples of companies saying that in Canada?
I don't, but there may be other regulators who do not have the authority to make binding orders, but nothing comes to mind.
Well, I was trying to think of a comparison. I was imagining when we have automobile recalls because of numerous accidents, that if an automobile company came back to us and said, yes, there were multiple accidents in Brazil, multiple accidents in the United States, multiple accidents in Britain. However, since you couldn't prove that anyone died in the highways of Canada, we don't recognize your role as a regulator to make us fix the fundamental problems in our vehicles because, and I just want you to correct me if I'm wrong, they said it would cost too much for them to comply with the laws of respecting the rights of Canadians. Would that be a fair comparison?
It's a good analogy. That so we were in discussions with them as to whether their privacy policies led to meaningful consent. They disagree that they did not obtain meaningful consent, but moreover, part of their arguments were, but in any event, there was no harm. No Canadian was harmed. You haven't found evidence that Canadians were harmed, which is a good analogy to your car accident example. So because we did not demonstrate harm to Canadians, you have no jurisdiction. Well, actually, point one, the legal foundation leading to risk and potential harm to Canadians we found was unsound, contrary to PEPEDA. And point two, we have seen harm in the US and in the UK based on the same weak legal foundation. So the same risk that manifested itself in the US and the UK could very well occur in Canada. And what we looked at was the terms and conditions. Cambridge Analytica was one manifestation of one third-party app. Facebook has millions of third-party applications. Clearly, there is harm for Canadians.
Well, I guess this is my question. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm thinking the basic concept of jurisdiction, and correct me if I'm wrong, I would think that jurisdiction means the country of Canada, of which you are a regulator, and citizens, 620-some thousand Canadians had their data taken because of this breach, that Facebook was aware of it for 3 years, made no efforts to tell Canadians that within the jurisdiction of Canada, they broke the law because they did not make any efforts to let any Canadian know that they had been the subject of this breach. Is Facebook putting forward the position that jurisdiction only counts, the jurisdiction only exists, if you can actually prove that Facebook physically caused harm by its actions?
It's pretty close to the position that we heard from them. They're not challenging our jurisdiction on the basis that they're in the U.S. or anything of the kind. They're challenging our jurisdiction on the basis that the terms and conditions we were examining did not, in their view, result in harm, and the absence of harm led to absence of jurisdiction. We think that we have jurisdiction because we have jurisdiction to look at the legal, what I call the legal foundation, i.e.
Well, you
the
have
terms and
jurisdiction
conditions.
because you're there to protect the rights of the citizens of our country as mandated by our parliament. Is that not how jurisdiction works? And your obligation is to protect our citizens,
And
whether
they're engaged, Facebook is engaged in commercial activity, which is subject to PEPEDA, which gives us jurisdiction.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Angus.